Hello everyone, and thank you for clicking the play button on this video. The issue I'm discussing is transgender homelessness and access to housing programs. This issue is both personally and professionally close to me, and this presentation is comprised of both research and experience. As a transgender person working with the homeless community in Cincinnati for 5 years and with 3 different agencies, I noticed some things particularly affecting transgender clients. There were things we were doing right and some things we could improve on. I think it's relevant to note that in suggesting that we can make improvements is not to vilify or wag a finger at anyone. This is not an organizational critique. It's an opportunity for growth, an aha moment. In 2022, homelessness affected over 582,000 Americans. In Ohio, this number is 10,654. And in Hamilton County, this is nearing 1,100 people. This data is based on reports from HUD's point-in-time count. This count is a physical count taken by shelter workers and outreach workers on what is thought to be the coldest night of the year, a time when many choose to access services. I have participated in 6 of these counts as an outreach worker. The limitations of this data includes the requirements of an outreach team to know a person's location or to encounter them when surveying popular camp areas on this night. It also excludes individuals who are couch surfing or living in hotels from this count. While these may be a good representation of the physical numbers of individuals in shelter or counted on the street, these do not reflect the total numbers of homeless individuals in other sleeping situations or living in locations unknown or unreported to local homeless organizations. Homelessness disproportionately affects the transgender community. Transgender and gender-diverse individuals experience significantly higher rates of homelessness when compared to the cisgender population. According to the White House's 2021 release of the Transgender-Day-of-Remembrance report, 1 in 3 transgender adults has experienced homelessness. That's over 30% of the transgender population, compared to 18% of the cisgender population, an increase of 12%. Additionally, of these transgender persons experiencing homelessness, the majority, 63%, are unsheltered, compared to 40% of the general population. Of those transgender individuals who did seek shelter, 41% were denied access, and 44% reported mistreatment or harassment while in shelter services. Despite the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force Policy Institute's 2003 publication of Transitioning Our Shelters, Best Practices for Trans-Inclusive Shelter Programs, homeless shelters continue to let trans people fall through the cracks. So why am I sharing this information? In my last position, working at a homeless shelter doing housing case management, I noticed a shelter practice that would potentially expose transgender residents to harm. At intake, residents are provided with identification cards reflecting their legal names. These are presented when a resident enters and exits shelter doors, goes through the cafeteria line, signs up for chores, registers for services, etc. This is problematic for trans folks because this requires outing oneself with every movement. In a private meeting with my director, who had recruited me from another agency and invited me to collaborate on a diversity, equity, and inclusion grant, I shared this concern and why it mattered to me. She was immediately receptive and thanked me for bringing it to her attention. 1 phone call and 2 emails later, the client IDs were changed. I was also assured that the practice of printing legal names and not preferred names was not our policy and must have been an oversight. Additionally, she let me know that she was reaching out to HR, a department of 1, to request a refresher course on intake procedures for RAs and front desk workers. I left the meeting feeling pride in our organization and satisfied with the response to my suggestion. A month after that, during a virtual conference on homelessness, we attended a seminar on gender diversity. Afterwards, we were asked, How are trans people showing up in housing? I found myself speechless, though I felt the expectation of a response. I was stunned. How are trans people showing up in housing? Why hadn't I noticed this before? They're not. I went outside and had a passionate conversation with a trusted coworker about the eye-opening revelation I had just had. We were interrupted briefly by our director, who apologized for missing a bi-monthly meeting with me. The same week, I found myself sitting in her office with HR standing in the corner, being told that I just wasn't a good fit. I was fired on the spot and my benefits were terminated that day. I was told to apply for unemployment and that the organization wouldn't fight it. She shook her head and asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" I wish I would have asked for a Medicaid and food stamp application on my way out, because truthfully, had I been slightly less resourced, I would have ended up homeless myself. I drove myself crazy trying to imagine what the reason could have been, as the whole situation suddenly felt incredibly sketchy. I'll spare you the messy details, but the only real reason is this. I was a trans person with a voice and ideas on how to better serve this marginalized population. I had been invited to sit at the table, but not to speak. And so to answer my director's question, how are trans people showing up in housing? They're not. At least not in the 3 programs I've worked in. Have I encountered transgender people on the street? Absolutely. Accessing shelter services? Sometimes. But are they actually making it to housing? Not on any of the caseloads I've seen. Housing matches, sometimes called vouchers, are issued by HUD based upon how a person scores on their Vulnerability Index service prioritization tool and how many months of documented homelessness they have experienced. This makes housing dependent on regular documentation of an individual as homeless by shelter and outreach workers. It also requires the careful administration of the VI-SPDAT by shelter and outreach workers in order to capture an accurate assessment of risk factors for prioritization. As someone who administered these assessments to the unsheltered population for 3 years, I can tell you that the tool is problematic and the questions are confusing. Without proper care in explaining the meaning of the questions, an individual may not receive an accurate score and be prioritized appropriately. This means that housing requires engagement with service providers. If trans people aren't able to access these services, or experience mistreatment and discrimination when they do access services, they disengage early or they don't engage at all. Naturally, if you have a bad experience and you don't feel seen or safe with a worker or in an environment claiming to provide you that, you're probably not going to want to stick around. With matches to housing programs being dependent on engagement with service providers, it makes sense that trans people aren't showing up in the numbers. Due to a history of transphobia, there is a lack of trust in institutions and organizations. If we can't keep transgender individuals engaged in services, we're blocking their access to federally funded housing programs. And in this way, service providers become gatekeepers. It's not uncommon to find that safe spaces aren't always safe. In a recent study conducted by the Williams Institute at UCLA, they found that 85% of transgender individuals experiencing homelessness avoid shelter systems entirely because of their fear of mistreatment by staff and other residents. Perceived danger and transphobia in shelter programs has a material impact on the life chances of transgender persons experiencing homelessness. It is imperative that shelter programs offer a welcoming and validating experience. Unsheltered transgender individuals have shockingly high rates of experiencing violence and vulnerability. 39% of unsheltered trans people report being attacked while homeless. 40% report being forced to do things they don't want to do. And 98% report engaging in risky behavior. such as exchanging sex for money, sharing needles, etc. The unsheltered transgender population are among the most vulnerable on the street. Too often, homelessness is perceived to be a failure of an individual and not the failure of the institutions in place to support them. Housing discrimination is a leading cause of homelessness among transgender individuals. 1 in 5 have experienced discrimination in searching for housing, and 1 in 10 have been evicted because of their gender identity. Lack of education about tenant rights also leads to housing discrimination and lack of housing options. Employment discrimination is also to blame for higher rates of homelessness. Because transgender people experience transphobia in the workplace and in seeking employment, many settle for low-wage jobs with pay that cannot keep up with the increased cost of living. Transphobia and exclusion in legal, educational, and healthcare institutions are also contributing factors to transgender homelessness. Lack of access to legal assistance, educational opportunities due to economic disparity, and access to inclusive and affordable healthcare are a few of the barriers faced by trans individuals. Family and social rejection leads to a weak or non-existent support system and lack of stability. This has an isolating effect and exacerbates mental illness and substance use disorder. Homelessness is not a moral failing of an individual. It is a reflection of our misplaced societal values. LGBTQ plus youth make up 20 to 40% of the total homeless youth population. Too often, trans youth find themselves rejected by their parents and kicked out of the home. Others find themselves fleeing to the street from abuse. Youth homelessness often leads to chronic homelessness and a lifetime of housing instability. So how can we begin to bridge the gap? How do we ensure homeless trans people engage in services? How do we ensure we're promoting transgender inclusion within our organizations and our community? I cannot claim to know how to solve this problem, as it stems back to a much larger issue of institutional and societal bias and discrimination. However, I will offer 3 suggestions to better the life chances of homeless transgender individuals. First, practice that matches policy. Second, employment of transgender service providers. And third, consideration of gender identity as a risk factor on HUD's housing prioritization tool. What would these changes look like? Policy and practice. While organizations receiving HUD dollars must comply with non-discrimination policies, are these policies being put into practice? We may boast a safe space sign on our door, but once inside, how safe is it actually? Trans people are looking for signs of safety and inclusion before we even get inside. Is the front desk environment welcoming? Is the admittance policy in accordance to assigned birth or self-identified gender? What about gender expression? How about our intake forms? Do they use trans-inclusive language? Do they inquire about legal name, preferred name, or both? Are there more than binary male-female gender options? Do they ask about pronouns? Once inside, are appropriate considerations made for the safety and privacy of trans residents in bathrooms, showers, and sleeping areas? Will workers respect preferred names and pronouns or engage in misgendering? Are grievances taken seriously and handled appropriately? Is the person reporting the grievance protected? Shelter systems and community organizations must ensure that non-discrimination policies are not just theoretical, they must be seen in action. Employment of transgender service providers. As I mentioned before, individuals with marginalized identities are assessing signs of safety and inclusion when accessing community services. Often, we are looking for workers and providers who might look like us or reflect a similar identity. There is a sense of safety in knowing that you are working with someone who shares your identity and will be sensitive and alert to the unique barriers you might experience. Organizations may benefit from recruiting and retaining employees at all levels of service who reflect the marginalized identities of individuals accessing these services. In this case, engagement in services is necessary for housing interventions, but engagement only happens when there is trust. Inclusion as a risk factor. The VI-SPDAT, HUD's housing prioritization tool, is a survey of questions about a person's lived experience of homelessness. This is sometimes referred to as a lethality assessment. The tool is meant to assess the risk factors experienced by an individual. This includes chronic health information, mental health and substance use information, questions about violence, police interactions, ambulance rides, emergency room visits, HIV status, legal issues, and engagement in risky behaviors. The answer to these questions generate points. The higher the risk factors, the higher the score. This score is then used to prioritize individuals for housing. This tool is currently being reviewed for racial bias. Additionally, I would suggest that a person with a gender identity that is anything other than cisgender, identifying with the gender assigned at birth, be considered as a risk factor. Numbers show that trans people, along with other marginalized identities, have significantly higher risk factors and chances of experiencing violence while homelessness, and additional barriers to housing. Consideration of transgender and gender nonconforming identities as a risk factor is not to simply prioritize trans folks over others, but to recognize the inherent risk factors associated with this identity. Homelessness doesn't discriminate. It's a complex issue that is a reflection of our societal values. In a capitalist society, ending homelessness may seem impossible, and in a transphobic world, homelessness is disproportionately affecting trans people. While ending homelessness may be the big goal, there are steps we can take in our communities to ensure that we are implementing inclusive policies and procedures to protect and enhance the outcomes for transgender individuals experiencing homelessness. Thank you for watching.